we've supported China's integration into the global economy for decades, opening doors, encouraging reforms, helping your entry into the WTO, but I have to say, your growth is accelerating faster than we anticipated.
Mr. President, the world is changing. The old balance of power no longer dictates the future. Our people deserve prosperity, and our nation must claim its rightful place on the world stage.
We must navigate this carefully, ensuring stability, protecting interests, and maintaining the rules that have governed international order for decades.
Indeed, we have to look at very closely.
Okay, so a few days ago, I stumbled upon an article and one thought struck my mind. Why is the US losing its global dominance? I mean, this is the country that gave us Silicon Valley, it gave us Hollywood, breakthroughs in science, renowned scientists, and pop culture that influenced the world. So, why suddenly is losing its world dominance? Is it because of BRICS? Or maybe shifting global orders? Or is it because of political factors like a Trump? Yeah, so if you look at the map back then, the USSR was massive. I mean, it stretched from Ukraine all the way across to Russia, down to Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and way beyond. On paper, it looked unstoppable, but what really went wrong? But wait a second, aren't we talking about the rise of the USA? So what's the role of the USSR? Well, US's so-called unipolar status only began with the fall of the USSR. And before that, US wasn't ruling the world alone. It always had a rival on the other side of the chessboard. And the Soviet was obviously so powerful, influential, and had the resources, but problem with them was it tried to match the US in everything. In military, in space, economy, science, innovation, and you name it, that race burnt it out. And by 1980s, America was spending about 6% of its economy on the military, and Soviet on the other side, they spent nearly 30%. Imagine this, you got $1,000 in the bank and your neighbor had $1 million, but because they spend $100 on the groceries, you decide to spend the same. It may look equal, but it crushes you, and that's exactly what happened to the USSR. By the way, Mikhail, he tried to save the USSR by introducing the reforms, what he called as openness and restructuring. But irony was, instead of fixing USSR, his reforms exposed just how broken it already was, and suddenly Soviet citizens could speak about empty shops, corruption, and inefficiency, and the first time in the history, people weren't really afraid of pointing out that the empire was crumbling. And obviously, Mikhail's reforms didn't work out. And on 26 December 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And here's the key. Its fall didn't just end the Cold War, it removed the only real counterweight to the United States. And from that day, the US wasn't just a superpower, it was the superpower. And the first time in the modern history, one nation stood completely alone at the top, and that was USA. Okay, back in the college, I learned the term known as transition economy. Nothing fancy, it simply means when country shifts from a centralized government to an open market where supply and demand matters. But wait a second, why am I telling you this? Well, after the fall of the USSR, that's exactly what the newly formed 15 nation became. They all became product hungry. And guess who stepped in? Obviously the US companies. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, McDonald's, these US companies flooded into this new market, and back in the USA, economies started to soar. Trillions were added to the GDP, millions of jobs appeared, unemployment dropped below 5%, and now with no Soviet Union to compete against, even a military budget got some breathing room. More than $100 billion was freed up. And this was a time when something was brewing up in the US internally, because this money, it fueled something new. It fueled what we call as dot-com boom. Entrepreneurs started building what they call as future. Google, eBay, Amazon, all was born in this era. And the internet boom didn't just grow US's economy, it made US the center of a digital revolution. But US influence wasn't just about money or technology. It was always a culture. It was Hollywood movies, it was pop music, it was blue jeans, even the idea of the freedom and openness. These things spread across the world as a soft power. As suddenly, US culture wasn't just American anymore, it was global. Okay, so quick note for the viewers, for any nation to be called as superpower, there are few boxes it has to be checked. First one is economic dominance. You need a huge economy that drives trade and finance worldwide. Second is military strength, not just a big flashy army, but ability to project a power anywhere on the earth. Third one is technology and innovation. Countries should lead in science, space, and now internet. And finally, culture. Your movies, your music, lifestyle, even your language becoming a global symbol because it increases the soft power of a country. And with all of this going on, this was the moment US realized it has to spread its wing into the Europe with the help of a NATO. Through this alliance, US became more than just a country, it became Europe's shield. NATO members leaned on US money, US logistics, US weapons. For much of the world, US wasn't just a partner, it was a guarantee of a protection. And by late 1990s, US wasn't just a strong country, it was the superpower, shaping economies, cultures, politics around the globe, even the world orders. And by this time, US was touching new heights and was enjoying the status of unipolar until okay, back in the history, this part of the world was the center of an economic universe. Like it literally had a dynasties which made a gunpowders, medicines, compass, paper, and whatnot. And by this part of the world, I mean India and China. But for now, let's just keep India aside and let's just focus on China. Now, cut to the 1800s China. China became so poor, so technologically backward due to all this war and invasions that everyone thought that China has now died, or at least it wouldn't be able to reclaim its throne as the economic hotspot until one American showed up.
Today, as I set foot on the soil of China, I believe we are beginning a journey that will change not only the relationship between our two nations, but the course of history itself.
And that American is none other than Richard Nixon. Yes, the 37th president of the US. He is the reason why today China is a global manufacturer. Nixon's visit to the China in Feb 1972 completely changed China's fate forever. Nixon's visit produced a Shanghai Communique. Now, Shanghai Communique is nothing but a joint statement by the United States and China in 1972. It was issued by the President Nixon and it marked a turning point in the Cold War. Both sides agreed to work toward normalizing relations, reduce tension in Asia, and respect each other's sovereignty. Now, you might be thinking, what was the US motive to help China? See, the simple reason why US was helping China was to counterbalance the USSR and with China's support. But little did they know, China would end up disturbing the balance of the US itself. US started helping China by many ways. Through student exchange program, it would give a scholarship to the Chinese student. They would share their tech in hope that China would open market for them. US saw the market opportunity in Chinese market. They set up the factories. They started investing in Chinese market. Now, by this time, China became such a favorite of the US that US Congress actually renewed its most favored nation status every day. But it was debated heavily. In fact, Bill Clinton said that we will support the entry of China in WTO only and only if China opens the market for USA company. And at this point, US thought that they had the market for the Beijing, but little did they know, floodgates was open on the other side. And China suddenly had unrestricted access to the American consumer market, and China began to grow. Now, before moving forward, just look around you and tell me how many made in China tags do you see. In fact, nearly 1 out of 3 products we use daily is made in China. You see, we are so dependent on China these days, but this all started with USA. By late 90s, US dependence on China was no longer a theory. It was becoming a reality. So US started to shift production overseas. And of course, main reason was the cheap labor and no restrictions on a trade environment. Factories were set up in Shanghai, which was capable of producing the goods in fraction of American cost and with great speed. And dependency was increasing so much that throughout 2000s, American store was filling with made in China goods. Toys, electronics, furniture, almost everything was flooding through these Chinese factories, and knowingly or unknowingly, US was feeding its own enemy. And there was a time that US actually had one of the strongest pharmaceuticals manufacturing bases. Most medicines were made locally and US didn't depend on anyone. But in 1990s and 2000s, that changed and US companies began outsourcing production to China. Chasing lower cost, over time, the supply chain shifted overseas and the stronghold American once had in the pharmaceuticals weakened. Factories closed at home, ports flooded with Chinese goods, and US economy leaned even harder on the Beijing. It wasn't dependence anymore, it was vulnerability, and China knew it. For thousands of years, humans have fought for the higher status. Higher status meant survival, better food, more allies, and more mates. Cut to the 21st century, status doesn't come from spears or hunting anymore. Now it's an iPhone in your hand, Levi's on your body, Coke in your fridge, and Justin Bieber in your playlist. And for the decades, the status symbol was all about being American. But here is a twist. By 2010s, the dominance started seeing cracks. Because as I stated earlier, China shifted just from manufacturing to producing the products. Take a TikTok for instance, look at this graph. US users spend an average of 43 hours and 53 minutes per month on TikTok versus 16 hours and 24 minutes per month on Facebook. Yoga from India, K-pop from Korea, and anime from Japan all were getting famous in US. People now started to do yoga, then going to gym, anime instead of MTV, and TikTok over Facebook. Now was the time US was not a lone trendsetter. And then there was a BRICS. I'm sure you have heard of Trump complaining about BRICS and how this organization is against US and US dollars. BRICS nations are big economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Combined, they make 40% plus of a world population and around 32% of a global GDP in PPP terms, and has a huge reserve of oil, gas, and rare earth. The BRICS are now focusing more on yuan and rubles. In fact, India now buys Russian oil in rupee and dirham, and this is exactly why Trump is sweating. And just like NATO has a World Bank, BRICS has a NDB, that is New Development Bank. And with all of this, US has now psychological fear of losing dollar dominance on the world, and the sanction may not work on the world anymore. Like despite of having hundred of sanctions on Russia, it still continues to grow. And talking about internal matters of the US, that is now exploding. It exploded past $34 trillion, and we all know about gun violence, political chaos, collapsing trust in institutions. This is just becoming normal for the US. And for the decades, US could hide its cracks behind its global dominance, but not anymore. The world is watching. And today in 2025, the US is still strong, militarily, financially, culturally, but the aura is gone. The shine has faded and the world is multipolar now. US now can't just say jump and expect everyone else to ask how high. So the story isn't about just US collapsing, it's about something more subtle and maybe the scarier. The slow decline of US dominance and the rise of something else.